ain't good. A little brake boost. What's up, everybody? Today's video is going to be a little bit different. I had this video requested by somebody, so I figured I would do it. And that is, what is brake boosting with a turbocharged car and how to do it. Now, to people who build cars, own turbocharged cars, might seem kind of stupid. Obviously, we know how to do it, but there are people just getting into the performance world who don't know what it is or how to do it. So I figured I would explain to the best of my abilities. So basically, you got to start out with the not history, but basics of turbocharging. So with a modern 4-stroke engine, you have obviously 4 strokes, and what that means is 4 strokes of the piston in between each firing stroke. So your first stroke, when the piston comes down, is going to be your intake, when it draws in the air and fuel into the cylinder that's going to be burned to create power. Then the first upstroke of the piston is your compression stroke. That's where the piston rings create a seal on the cylinder walls inside of the engine, and as the piston comes up, it compresses the air and fuel inside of the cylinder to make it more volatile, to make it burn easier. Then you have your ignition stroke, which is where the piston's at the top of its first upward stroke. The spark plug fires. That causes the piston to come down. That's your power stroke. That's where the engine produces its power, is when that spark plug fires, ignites that air and fuel, which pushes the piston down. Then your last upward stroke, the 4th stroke, is your exhaust stroke, where all of that burned air and fuel is ejected from the cylinder so that you can, that's bright, so that you can basically get rid of all those gases to clear the cylinder for the next intake stroke, so it can draw that air and fuel in again without the old stuff still being in the cylinder. Well, for a turbocharged engine, you have what is called forced induction. Basically, there's 3 styles of forced induction. There's nitrous, turbocharging, supercharging. Now, technically, turbocharging is supercharging, but generally, there are differences within the automotive community about what those are. A supercharger is generally mechanically driven off of the crankshaft. A turbocharger is usually thermally driven off of the exhaust. Well, with a naturally aspirated car, the amount of air it can draw in with the suction of the piston is the amount of air the engine is going to get. You can maximize that with cam profiles, with porting, with compression, but you're limited on how much air you can get into the cylinder. So what forced induction does is adds oxygen to the cylinder through compressing your normal air to make it more dense, which then creates a pressurized charge in your cylinder, which allows more fuel to be injected. The more air and fuel you can get into a cylinder with the same volume, the more power it's going to produce from a larger explosion. So with turbocharging, there are basically 3 things that are going to affect how fast your turbo spools. Number 1 is going to be exhaust gas temperature and flow. Number 2 is going to be the type of fuel that you're using and how volatile it is, which also ties into your exhaust gas temperature and flow, and the amount of load that the engine is under. That's why, like, an Cummins turbo diesel, just like driving normally at 60 miles per hour, is probably not going to be producing any boost. Whereas if that same truck was towing a 25,000 pound trailer, it'd probably be cruising at 20 psi a boost at 60 miles per hour because of the fact that there's more load. So basically, with brake boosting, what you're doing is you're creating more load at a lower RPM than the engine can see just under the weight of the car, your rolling resistance, air resistance, that will all create certain loads at different speed, drivetrain losses, friction. Well, brake boosting basically allows you to give more throttle while maintaining an RPM to load the engine up and spool the turbo without the RPMs rising like they would be if you just planted your foot. So if you plant your foot, then the engine will be at full load, but the RPMs will be rising as that turbo starts to spool up under that load. It takes a second, which is generally one of two things, your boost threshold or boost lag. What boost threshold is it is the RPM at which there is enough exhaust gases being produced under normal driving for the turbo to start spooling. Your boost lag is how long it takes from once the turbo starts spooling to when the turbo is at full steam, when it gets to full RPM to produce the boost level that you're trying to make. So you're limited by load basically at that point. So what brake boosting does is it allows you to add load to the engine without increasing RPM. So in other words, your turbo is spooled up quicker than it would be just under normal driving. So for instance, this is going to be just, so I'm in second gear, hardly any throttle, 2000 RPM, I plant it. It takes a second for the boost to kick in, right? But if I brake boost, then instead of the RPMs rising and as the turbo comes into boost, the RPMs really start going, you can get that turbo to produce the same boost without the RPMs rising, so that when you do let off your brakes, you have an engine under full load already, under full boost, to where the load that you already have is plenty to keep the turbo spooled at full boost so that you can keep going. So like brake boost would be, okay, so I get to an RPM, plant the brakes, no boost lag. See what I'm saying? You hold that brake pedal as you're applying throttle, that boost will rise up to your preset boost level at that lower RPM. You let off the brake, bam, you have instant power. You don't have to wait for the turbo to spool up. You don't have to wait for those higher RPMs to make power, because you've already spooled your turbo to make full positive pressure in the cylinder. So again, this is no brake boost. Takes a second, right? Then with brake boosting, nothing. Turbo is already spooled, so you don't have to wait for it. So that's how brake boosting works. How to brake boost is you modulate your throttle and your brakes with your right and left foot. You use both feet at the same time. So instead of it being like normal driving where you either are off the throttle with your foot on the brake, either pushing the clutch in, or with the car in neutral and the clutch out. So you're using one foot to modulate throttle and modulate brakes. It's one or the other. With brake boosting, you take your left foot, you put your left foot on the brake pedal, and you start to apply brakes as you apply throttle. And what that does is it maintains your speed while you can actually add that throttle to spool the turbo up and to load the engine. So, you know, I don't think you'll be able to see the boost gauge, but I'll switch the camera up here and hold it on the boost gauge under both circumstances so that you guys can see what I'm talking about. All right, so this is normal, just planting your foot. You gotta wait for a second, right? Well, with brake boosting, you hold your brakes, plant your throttle, and it's already at full boost. So again, this is no brake boost. And this is with brake boosting.